A lot of people, I think, feel like sign languages are just one thing where they say, oh, I'm going to learn sign language. But one of the things I've noticed when I've delved into this is that sign languages are really varied. There's a lot of variation there. Can you tell me a little bit about how they're different from each other?
The main area of difference is really, as far as we can tell, in vocabulary, but there are grammatical differences. But I suspect it's still a working hypothesis. Most of us work on the hypothesis that sign languages are more similar to each other grammatically than unrelated spoken languages. But there is a lot of cross-linguistic difference, that's for sure. What's amazing is that signs can be iconic in different sign languages, but of course they can choose different features in the form of the sign. So one sign in Auslan for cat is a sign that looks like this. Okay, it's just a simple sign that refers to patting. Okay, The sign used in British Sign Language for cat is like this. It looks like the whiskers of a cat. But my favorite is a sign used in Japan, in Japanese Sign Language for cat, which is like the licking the paws, the cat licking its paws. So like that. So they each pick different aspects, distinctive aspects of a cat's appearance or its behavior. So you get a lot of, even though signs are often iconic, there's some link between the form and the meaning of the sign. This can vary enormously across different sign languages. There's lots of great examples in Japanese Sign Language. So, for example, the sign for me or I in Japanese Sign Language involves a point at the nose, okay, whereas in Auslan and BSL, it's at the chest. The sign for siblings in Japanese Sign Language is interesting. It looks like flipping the bird.
With both hands.
Yeah. It looks like, so you extend the middle finger from the fist and you wave your hand around in the air kind of thing. So that means sibling. But for older sibling, then you move one of those hand shapes up compared to the other one.
Right.
For younger sibling, you move it down. So, I mean, there is a lot of variation. I run a bit of a campaign on Twitter whenever I spot organizations referring to sign language in the singular. I kind of respond with the hashtag sign languages.
Very good.
Because even people in the deafness area forget, and they talk about sign language interpreters and sign language classes, and they forget to be more specific. So often when they try to engage with their audience to attract people to a class, for example, they'll say, come and learn sign language. But once you get there, then you find out, oh, actually, it's just Auslan or it's just BSL or it's just American Sign Language. It's not like there's no universal sign language. But
now that I'm thinking about it, I'm also thinking, gee, in my spoken English, I swap between different styles and different registers, highfalutin and casual throughout a day. Does that exist in, say, Auslan as well?
Yeah, I mean, the registers, there are definitely different degrees of formality. There are signs that are a bit slangy that you wouldn't use in a more formal context, for example. There are ways of signing that are more formal, so obviously relating to the clarity of the production of the message. We did a study in Auslan looking at the fact that signs that in citation form, so in their dictionary form, are made on the forehead. So a sign like no, where you take you tap the side of your forehead with your extended thumb from your fist. So that means to know something or someone.
Right.
Okay? That sign in a formal context will be produced there, but often in conversation, the sign will be lowered so that it's produced in the middle of the signing space, just in front of the signer's chest, because that's where, of course, your hands are most easily held. So it's kind of economy of effort. So you just move your hands directly in front of the body. And so in an informal context, that will often occur. The sign will drop. And there are signs like no that do that quite a lot. And as well as that, the sign for I or me, which involves an index finger pointing at your chest, okay, it can assimilate. It can take on features of a sign that follows it. So often if you want to sign I do not know, in a formal context, you extend the index finger very clearly from the fist and point it into your chest. And then you have a flat hand, which you hold near your forehead and you move away, okay, as you shake your head. And that's I don't know. But often what you get in an informal context is the sign for me is the same hand shape. It's just a flat hand held at the middle of the chest, and then you just get a movement away to midnight. And that's literally Auslan for dunno.
Wow. All right. Well, already I'm seeing a few problems in the concept that I wanted to talk to you about. And that is that I've been noticing a few articles this week about people who have invented a sign language glove.
Mm-hmm.
We've already mentioned a few things that might be snags, right? Because first of all, there's variation, but that's okay. I can figure that. But there's also, I mean, the gloves would cover your hands, but that's just your hands.
Yes, exactly.
We're talking about where it is on your body and where it is like on your head and where it's moving.
Yeah. I mean, also, as I pointed out, the fact that when you sign don't know, you often shake your head. So this is the first major problem with the signing glove technology, is that it seems to be based on the assumption that only the hands are necessary to read the sign language signal. But of course, sign languages use other parts of the body, not just the hands. In some cases, some signs don't involve the whole arm. So the sign for Scotland, okay, is a movement of your elbow. So it's like the gesture people often use for chicken. Okay?
Oh, yeah.
So it's just a movement. The hand shape is less important. You can have a variety of hand shapes. What is significant, what is salient, the articulator, is the whole arm moving backwards and forwards next to your body. So there are signs that don't involve the hands. Then there are other features of sign languages like movement of the head, changes in facial expression, mouth gestures.
Wow. Can you give me an example of those?
Well, a mouth gesture, for example, if you want to sign I'm driving, so you hold your hands as if you're holding a steering wheel in front of you. And if you want to sign I'm driving in a normal fashion, okay, you will have a small pout on your mouth like that. And that means driving in a normal fashion. Okay, if you want to say you were driving after maybe, too many drinks, okay,
which you should never do.
Or if you were driving without paying attention, okay, then you would protrude your tongue. And that means driving carelessly. Okay? Right. So the mouth gesture can have adverbial meanings. It can affect the meaning of the sign. So there are mouth gestures, there are head movements like shaking your head for negation, to negate something, or nodding your head to affirm something, raising your eyebrows for a yes-no question, okay, furrowing your brows for a WH question. So there's so much more than just the hands involved. So this is the big hurdle for glove technology, is you actually need a body glove.
Okay. All right. Well, that makes things a little more complicated, I guess.
Secondly,
yes,
what does the person who's watching the deaf person do? So the deaf person presumably has these gloves. Okay? So you can go from a sign language into a spoken language. But then what happens to the hearing person who doesn't sign? Mm-hmm. How do they respond?
They would need some kind of device as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just you just feel like saying, just learn to sign. I mean, obviously, actually, deaf people have all sorts of ways of communicating with people who don't sign. They're experts at it. They live their entire lives surrounded by people who don't use sign languages. So they're really good at extracting meaning from, seemingly random gestures and mouth patterns from people who don't sign. They're very good at it. They get by every day without this kind of technology by coming up with other ways to communicate. Some deaf people, when they go into if you're in a restaurant, you can point at the menu, you can write things down, you can use a surprising amount of shared gestural knowledge. There's so many ways that you can communicate if you choose not to use spoken language in particular contexts.
Okay, so I can see why the sign language glove is kind of a terrible idea, but it's a very popular idea. People seem to keep coming up with this thing again and again. Why is that? I think,
to be fair, on the computer science and engineering community, I think they are fascinated by the problem. Okay, it's a problem that has applications. So it has applications, I think, with human-computer interfaces. So even though it's often billed as a tool for communicating with deaf people. Actually, I think, as we see in the increasing sophistication in which we interact with computers, so the swiping of the phone screen and the touch screen, that kind of thing, the writing on an iPad, all these kinds of interfaces. I think that's really where the applications are, and that's what's driving the interest from the electrical engineering and computer science kind of community. They're interested in developing the technology that can deal with this, and they often, I think, bill it as a way to assist communication between deaf and hearing people. But the fact is, often they don't work with people from the deaf community. They create this technology without working with sign language researchers, without working with deaf community members in many cases. Some people in the industry do work closely with deaf communities and with sign language linguists, but not everyone does. So here in the UK, we have computer scientists who are really interested in gesture and sign language recognition technology. So being able to recognize sign languages in a video clip, okay, so that translation could be partly automated.
That would be really good. Yeah.
That's very useful. That's very useful. And we're working closely with these kind of computer geeks because that has direct applications in our linguistics research. So if we can get any kind of automation, automatic recognition of sign language data, video data, then that will help with our analysis. For example, our building video collections of data. Because at the moment, we have to manually translate every example of video data that we get. We have to look at the signs, decide what they mean, and then, enter in some kind of translation. If any of that could be automated and speed up the process of sign language coding, that would help researchers like us enormously. It would also help sign language interpreters. It would help sign language teachers. It would have a lot of applications. So that kind of technology us sign language researchers are really keen on. And we, as I said, my colleagues at University College London are cooperating with some computer scientists from Oxford who are some of the leading figures in this kind of research. For gesture and sign language recognition.
So yeah. I guess the real solution is work on approaches that look at the whole body, maybe via video. But also, that's only going to be half the picture because, as you say, it gets things out, but it doesn't get anything in.
Yeah.
Is the solution for everybody just to learn a sign language that's near them?
Well, I recognize not that everyone will have the opportunity to learn a sign language, but we already have a solution to the problem, and they're called sign language interpreters. And, I trained as a sign language interpreter myself. I trained as an Auslan English interpreter in Australia back in the 90s. And I did a little bit of work in the industry for a few years. I don't make a great interpreter because being neutral is not something that comes easily to me.
Just disappearing.
Yes. So, one of the aspects of sign language interpreting, which I admire greatly in professional sign language interpreters, is their ability to control their facial expressions and etc. while they're signing, so that they're only conveying the message that's coming from the speaker or from the signer to the speaker. Some of my first interpreting jobs were for two deaf friends of mine and colleagues who were studying linguistics at Macquarie University in Sydney. And so they were like, great, you're the guy, you're doing a PhD in linguistics, we want you to interpret. But actually, of course, I'd be hearing some lecture content that I didn't exactly agree with sometimes. And so there'd be a little arch of my eyebrow or something that took me away.
Yes.
And the deaf person, of course, who's looking at you the whole time to get the message, mostly looking at you, occasionally looking at the lecturer or the board or other people in the room, but mostly looking at you. They pick it up.
You couldn't resist that eye roll, could you, Adam?
What, you disagree? Yeah, what, you disagree? I mean, that's the thing. I've got these gigantic, very mobile eyebrows, which I can't control. My deaf clients would be like, what? You disagree with the lecturer? And I'm like, no, I'll tell you later. I keep interpreting. I need to keep interpreting. But they'd be like, no, tell us why. And of course, you could have a whole side conversation with the deaf student and it wouldn't disturb the lecturers because it's silent and you're in the corner somewhere out of view. And it's a really difficult skill to master. The fact that you can't get you have to be you are a person. You're not a black box. Obviously, you are a human being, but you have to keep the focus on the message and not edit it or running commentary on it while you're doing it.
You know, I keep noticing these stories where people are amazed that a sign language interpreter will be expressive. This just happens over and over again, and I just roll my eyes.
I know. We all, yeah. I mean, some of the ones that have featured, particularly in the American media, you know, they are very expressive examples of American Sign Language users. They are highly expressive, and not everyone is as expressive as some of the interpreters and the presenters that you've seen in social media. There is a lot of variation in degrees in those kinds, but what you see is well within the normal range. So yes, the fact that people are that's part of what sign languages are. That's part of how they work. Because everything has to be visual. So the equivalent of intonation, stress, emphasis, all these things have to be realized visually. And there's also other stuff that's going on that so a furrowed brow during a WH question might be misinterpreted by a non-signer as a sign of anger, so often there's some degree of misinterpretation of some of the, or like the tongue protrusion mouth gesture that I gave you, that might look like some kind of negative comment on something that's been. So there is also, because there are aspects of sign languages and gesture that hearing and deaf people share, but there are also aspects that are quite different. So non-signers might not be aware that certain things that they think, like the raised middle finger, which is common in a number of traditional Auslan signs, for example, without any association with the obscene gesture. In fact, a sign like holiday involves the extended middle finger from the fist being moved in circles in front of the signer, and it looks like something quite rude or obscene. So, there's often misunderstandings like that. When people see interpreters, they think they understand what they're seeing, but they don't.
Wow. All right. Now, I know where to get a sign language interpreter, but I know that not everybody does, so that can't be the way forward for everybody. I'm trying to think of something magical that we can do to help boost representation and turn down the language discrimination that happens for deaf people.
Well, yeah. I mean, the number one way to do that is to sign up to an Auslan class in the case of Australia. Sign up to a sign language class. Absolutely. Even if you only complete it to a certain level, then at least if you have some basic sign language skills that you can use when you encounter a deaf person, that makes a huge difference. Just even having a little bit of the basics, or even understanding that, when you are interacting with a deaf person, you make eye contact, you look directly into their face, you make sure that your communication is in their line of sight. You don't kind of, natter away and look into your bag exactly, or point at the menu and speak at the same time, so that their attention is potentially divided. You point, then you speak, then you point again, so you bracket the behavior so that they can see what you're pointing at and give an opportunity to read your lips as well, or look at your facial expression, or look at your gestures. So even basic tips like that make a huge difference. I was surprised because the other day we had a guest presenter from Nottingham Trent University, which is a university not far from here at the University of Birmingham. And she was talking about having a deaf student in her class, and she was referring to the interpreter as the signer. And she described the student as someone with hearing difficulties. And I was really disappointed to hear this, because I think that people like lecturers at university who have deaf students in their class, they really should be briefed by the university's student support services on the appropriate terminology. So that person sitting next to you who might have an undergraduate degree or postgraduate qualification in interpreting is not a signer. They're an interpreter, okay? It's a professional qualification. You can't do this job without appropriate training, without in Australia, you get accredited by the National Accreditation Authority for Translators and Interpreters, like everyone else, like all other interpreters and translators do in Australia. So you have to sit an exam, you study, you have to be trained to do this. So it's a profession. Okay, so acknowledging that the interpreter is an interpreter and is a professional is one thing. Not calling them a signer, which is kind of a bit. Secondly, knowing that deaf people who use sign language are deaf people. That's the term that they use. They say that they are deaf. There's no stigma associated with someone from the deaf community, using the term deaf. But often hearing people, because of all this political correctness around deafness and disability and ethnic minorities and, I hate the term culturally and linguistically diverse. Okay. Oh. My father's family was 100% Maltese. How were they culturally and linguistically diverse? I mean, yes, they were bilingual in English and Maltese, but, I hate this term. I guess it was supposed to be introduced to describe, and how are English-speaking people not culturally and linguistically diverse? You're from the US, right?
Right.
Okay, so your culture is different from Australian culture. We are culturally and linguistically diverse. Even though we both speak English, we're from other. I really, I hate this kind of stuff. But anyway, all the words that are used around disability, people don't know what terms, hearing difficulties, hearing impairment, but actually people in the deaf community they call themselves deaf people.
Well, those are some great suggestions, and that has made me think about stuff that I hadn't thought about before. Is there anything else that people really need to know about deaf people?
I think that one of the key things that surprises many hearing people, and you might not know that you're a hearing person, because until you interact with deaf people, you never hear this term.
You're right, I am.
That's what we are. You and I are hearing people.
Yeah.
Okay. So hearing people are surprised that many deaf people feel neutral about their deafness or even positive. I think that surprises a lot of hearing people. So, for example, when a deaf child is born to deaf parents, for many deaf people, that's a source of joy.
Because then that means that their culture will continue.
Yes, and also because if a deaf person is born into a deaf family, we know they have the best opportunities for normal language development because they'll be exposed to sign language from birth. So this kind of neutral to positive feelings about deafness often comes as a surprise to hearing people, I think, who are not familiar with the community and who think about deafness as hearing loss and as a negative thing. Deaf activists like to promote the idea of deaf gain. Not hearing loss,
not hearing loss.
Deaf gain.
Right.
Deaf gain. So, for example, I saw a tweet the other day about this deaf American guy who wears hearing aids, and he has digital hearing aids which are quite powerful, so he can hear quite a lot with the digital hearing aids. But he just videoed himself signing in ASL. I just arrived in this restaurant and there's a screaming baby right next to me. And he just takes off his hearing aids and he goes, deaf gain.
That's great. Yeah. And, I always thought of deafness as a disability, but I think now I've realized it's only really a disability in the context of a culture that doesn't understand deafness.
Yeah, exactly. And we do have lots of examples of communities around the world in which there are disproportionately high numbers of deaf people in that community. We have some in Northern Australia. There are some communities in the Northern Territory where there are disproportionately high numbers of deaf people within that particular Indigenous community. And what happens in those communities is that everyone within that community has some degree of sign language skill. Okay. And so there are a number of those communities all around the world. There's another one in northern Bali. There are communities, they're called deaf villages, okay, because they're often small, remote communities, and we've discovered them all over the world. They're everywhere. There seem to be dozens and dozens of them all around the world so for example, the Bali case, Desa Kolok, this village in northern Bali, there are about 2,000 people in the village and about 50 people in that community are deaf. So every extended family probably has a deaf member. And how that has happened is because the gene for deafness within that population has been expressed disproportionately more frequently because there's been lots of intermarriage within that community, which has meant that the deafness gene has become quite dominant in that community. Now, what we know is that there have been generations of deaf people in that community. Everybody signs to a certain hearing and deaf sign in that community. There are all sorts of cultural practices that are reserved for deaf people. So, for example, for some reason in the village, only deaf people can bury the dead. Only deaf people can look after the plumbing in the village. So there is a special deaf dance that deaf people do at certain times to celebrate. They believe, because it's a Hindu community, they believe there is a deaf god that brings deaf people into the world.
Wow.
And so they are fully integrated into the life of the community. There's no real deaf community there because they are part of that community in general. So it's recognized that they are different from hearing people, but they are not treated any differently because everyone signs. So they are fully integrated into that community. So yes, in that community, being deaf is hardly a disability at all. It's just seen as a normal variant of being human. So we know that part of the problem for deaf people in a large country like Australia is the fact that there are relatively few of them. And so most people go through life without experiencing extended contact with the deaf community. And so they don't, their perception of what deafness is inaccurate. They see it as a kind of isolating, lonely kind of disability, whereas most of the deaf people I know have very busy and fulfilling social lives. And, loneliness is not a problem. It's a small community. It's a tightly knit community. It's frustrating because it takes a long time to learn to sign fluently, like to learn any other language. I generally found that I was lucky because my first long-term partner, he had deaf parents. So that's how I got involved in the community, through that connection. But it took me a long time because he was a native signer and he grew up signing, and he would sign really very rapidly and fluently with his deaf parents and other deaf people in his family. He had other deaf relatives, deaf aunts, uncles, cousins. I just would look at it in awe and say, oh my God, I'm never going to master that, And he wouldn't teach me. He was like, no, I'm not going to teach you. You go to a class. And finally, I started going to a class. And the funny thing is, that was a long time ago, but I'm still very much like, I started learning when I was about 25. Now I'm 52. And what that means is I've spent nearly all my adult life having some contact with deaf communities. And so it's a big part of my life. I can't really imagine not being part of this community and this language. It's enriched my life enormously. I'm currently dating someone and, I'm kind of teaching him a few signs because I can't imagine, for me, the idea, I would like to have a long-term relationship with someone else who could sign because it's such a big part of my life that, we've only been dating 6 months, but I'm already teaching him signs.
He should go to a class.
Yeah, he should go to a class. I'm trying to encourage him. Yeah, as I said, my life has been enormously enriched by this experience. And I think the same would be true for any hearing person who decides to learn a sign language and to work with deaf people. The other key message is, yes, Australian technological ingenuity was involved in the development of the cochlear implant, which is an amazing technology. It doesn't cure deafness, but it does, for a lot of deaf people, it does increase their access to spoken language. So, for many, many deaf people, it's a very positive thing. But one thing that concerns me is that many of the organizations that promote the cochlear implant to hearing parents of deaf children don't talk about the possibility of bilingualism. Often the cochlear implant is sold as a kind of cure for deafness and as a way for the deaf child to learn to speak and be integrated into the hearing world. Well, that deaf child, every deaf child is born with a history and a cultural legacy of the deaf community. And I feel that they need access to that community. So I think I'm pro the choice for cochlear implants because it does, there's a lot of research to suggest that it does facilitate the acquisition of spoken language skills for deaf children. But I'm all for bilingual education. You give deaf children the choice. You give deaf children the option to do both. So you give them sign language, access to sign languages from early childhood as well, because you never know what that deaf child is going to choose in the future. And if you give them access to a sign language and to a spoken language, they never have to choose. They have access to both worlds, both communities, both languages, both communication modes. And, we know that bilingualism has lots of cognitive benefits. So why not go for it?
That's true. Okay. Great advice. Adam Schembri, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge about sign languages with me today.
Thank you for having me.